We have joining us now Professor Yang Jun-sok, a professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea, to talk more on the President's press conference. It's good to have you with us today.
Happy to be here.
So, as it was much expected, President Moon devoted a lot of time discussing issues about the economy during his New Year's press conference yesterday. I could say about 70% of his opening address was regarding the economic issues. I mean, what does that tell us about the situation with South Korea's economy right now?
Okay, well, it does tell, I think, that the economy is now the #1 pressing issue compared to last year when I think North Korean issue took a lot more of the percentage of the speech. And secondly, as we saw in the story before here, the economy is not in a good shape. Everything is pointing downwards, and everything has potential to become worse this year, even still. And then in addition, well, if you remember last year at this time, we were very optimistic about the economy. We were coming off of 3.1% growth in 2018. Exports were rising after falling in 2017 and 2016. And we were hoping that, well, if the export growth goes up and it sparks increase in consumption and investment, then we will continually have a growth rate of 3% or above. Now, this year, it seems like we're going to come in around 2.8%. That's coming back to the levels that we saw from about 2010s. So we're going back to about average over the last decade. But because we were so optimistic at the beginning of last year, I think it's disappointing even more because we expected so much more this year.
There was a lot of criticism that President Moon faced last year for some of his policies that he perhaps put forward. And I think he pointed out himself that perhaps the most disappointing thing for him last year was the fact that he tried to tackle the jobs figures, the job situation, the employment situation, but he failed to really make much of a dent, it seemed. I mean, what did he say yesterday that you think might suggest that his plans for this year might be different?
I don't think he pointed anything that said that it will be substantially different this year. What struck me about the speech that he made was that unlike the last year's or the speech he made 2 years ago, there's more talk about supply side issues. He talked a lot about regulatory reform and regulatory sandbox. He talked a lot about innovation in new technology, new industries. So that's a bit different from last year. Last year there was some talk about it, but it wasn't emphasized very much at all. And I think he's looking to these new innovations to create new jobs. But first of all, these new type of high-tech jobs that he was talking about, they'll probably provide jobs for skilled workers. But the problem is a lot of the unemployment problems that are taking place now deals with unskilled workers. So it's questionable how much help it's going to be to them. And then second problem is that, well, even if we do get these new high-tech jobs started, we're not quite sure whether they'll be able to commercialize it. And even if they do, it'll probably take a long time. So another interesting point that I think he made was that we have to get around interest groups in order to have innovation. But just in terms of job creation, he didn't talk about it very much. If we look at the 2019 budget that he submitted, well, it was formed by the old economics team, so there might be some changes. But it seemed like he doubled down on the policies that he made in 2018. And the problem is a lot of those policies, a lot of those programs were not very effective. And the fact that he's doubling down on those policies seemed a bit worrisome.
Yes, because he admitted himself as well in his opening remarks. He said despite the public sentiment dropping towards his economic policies, he kind of doubled down. He said that this year's objective is to show that the government's economic policies is heading in the right direction. I mean, that's what he said. I mean, is it really what kind of reaction, what is your reaction to that statement, basically?
Well, I think he really needs to look at the programs that he set and prioritize. He's come under a lot of criticism for the minimum wage and the 52 work hour programs, policies, and I think a lot of people feel that that made the unemployment problem worse because it raised the labor costs, especially for unskilled labor. But I think President Moon is really convinced that this is necessary for people's well-being and this is necessary for country's future. The problem is because it's working against the economic growth at the moment, he should prioritize, should we deal with the minimum wage problem even though it'll cause slower growth in the present, or should he slow down the minimum wage growth in order to provide more growth now? I think a lot of the programs that he had, maybe because of, maybe he does have good intentions, but a lot of the programs he has are working against each other. So in a sense, they're making the problem even worse. Minimum wage is one big example, I think. 52-hour work week is another. They're all raising the labor costs perhaps too much for some of the marginal firms to handle.
Let's talk a bit more about that, because that was part of his income-led growth policy that he put out there. Can you explain a bit more about that, what his thinking is behind that and what he's trying to achieve there?
Okay, well, the original idea behind the income-led growth policy was that if people have more income, then they'll buy more products, that'll create more demand, it'll raise consumption and raise investment. As far as the theory itself goes, I think it's a bit valid, but also there's a problem. When we look at macroeconomic policies, we usually deal with short-term cyclical policies and long-term growth policies. Short-term cyclical policies deal with, well, if you have a recession, and you have loss of jobs, loss of income, so loss of demand, which feeds up on itself. How do you stop that? How do you try to minimize the negative impact? Well, government puts in more product, government supports income, unemployment insurance, so it tries to minimize the negative effect from those lack of demand, but it's not a growth policy. It does not raise wages substantially because it does not raise productivity. If you're working for a company, well, company can only afford to pay you what you make, and if you don't have an increase in productivity, so you don't make more, then company cannot afford to pay you more. And I think the government tried to package the income support policies as growth policies, and that's one of the reasons why it didn't work. I think the government is finally paying more attention to growth policies because he spent a substantial amount of time yesterday talking about new industries, regulatory reform, regulatory sandbox, which is very helpful to create new industries and increase productivity. But I think that's a realization that income-led policies by itself will not fundamentally change the labor conditions of Korea.
I think that goes into my next question as well. I mean, perhaps we've been focusing somewhat on the negative aspects because last year's economy was so difficult for South Korea. But what from the press conference you see yesterday that you thought might be encouraging for the year ahead? Okay,
well, I keep going back to the productivity-based policies, regulatory reform, more innovation. I think it's absolutely important that Korea maintains that type of policy, and it's good to recognize that the President Moon is now emphasizing on this area as well. China, if we want to keep ahead of China in terms of technology, then we need a lot of productivity policies as well. Problem is, a lot of welfare policies and productivity policies sometimes clash. If you want to raise labor productivity, then it's vitally important to have a flexible labor market where if you're not doing well at your job, then you can get fired. Problem is, the Korean labor market is very rigid. So I think that's one of the reasons why Korean labor productivity is considered relatively low compared to other countries. It's also a reason why I think a lot of 20-year-olds are trying to not have a high unemployment rate because, well, they want to get into good jobs, but the places on the good jobs will not open up unless some of the people who are there already get fired, so more jobs open up. So I think it's a good thing that President Moon is recognizing the need for productivity-based policies, but I think we need to go more.
Let me talk one more subject before we go as well. So President Moon also talked yesterday, as we heard in the previous report, about the potential economic benefits that could come from a peaceful inter-Korean relations. In fact, he said inter-Korean economic cooperation will bring new vitality to our economy, and this opportunity is ours only. But he also says, I'm not sure when we'll make use of this opportunity, but I think it's a blessing reserved for us. I mean, how real is this potential? And at the same time, how far away is it? Because obviously, you know, things with North Korea are still very much on a knife edge.
Well, at the very least, the UN and US sanctions has to end, because we cannot have any kind of economic relationship where there's a real exchange of resources unless the sanctions are over. Right now, only some humanitarian relationships are allowed, and Kaesong Industrial Park cannot be considered as a humanitarian measure. Once the sanctions are eliminated, I think you can get Kaesong Park to restart fairly quickly. The type of industries that are in Kaesong are not very complex, so maybe a few months to get the factories back online, and it should be working again. But if you really want to fully utilize the North Korean labor, think about, say, Foxconn in China, then you need a more full relationship, more full partnership. And I'm not sure that could be achieved in the short term, especially in terms of things like technology or getting the United States to accept Kaesong products as made in Korea.
We've got one more question before we go as well, while we have you here. So South Korea's economy, looking ahead, is not only tied into South Korea, but obviously there's external factors as well, things happening around the world. And perhaps the biggest global economic issue right now is the US-China trade war. But this week, representatives from the two sides met in Beijing, and it looks like some sort of basic groundwork towards a resolution seems to have been laid. What do you make of the results of these latest talks, and how do you think that will tie into what happens in South Korea as well over the next year?
Okay, well, both sides are not mentioning too many concrete agreements. There has been some mention that China has agreed to buy more American agricultural products. They will reduce some trade barriers on American manufactured goods, and they did agree to, at least in principle, have restrictions on technology, forced technology transfers and more freedom for American firms working in China. But I believe the USTR was very concerned about enforcement, and that's why they stayed an extra day to negotiate. If I may give a warning, if you look at these type of trade negotiations, they start with the easy stuff first, and usually they come very quickly to agreement on the easy stuff. But then they get stuck on a few hard lines, a few hard policies, and they drag on forever, and the relationship gets worse. USTR Lighthizer has said that he may have to raise tariffs to get China to listen. So things are going to get very harder before it gets better. And usually what ends up happening is that they play a chicken game until right at the end of the deadline. And then usually, not always, they come up with a miraculous agreement right at the end, or maybe just slightly after the end. But there are a few times when that agreement didn't take place. So we'll have to see, but things are going to get worse before it comes better.
Well, we'll have to end it there. Professor Yang, thank you for sharing us your thoughts today.
Thank you.